Hi, everyone. I'm Bethany Introduction from the Digital Library Federation, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, who is someone whose thoughtful and active approach to organizing the library and archives community around issues related to climate change I have long admired. But before I do that, I want to say a quick word of thanks on behalf of the DLF to all of you who represent institutions that are not only NDSA members, but members of the Digital Library Federation as well. So NDSA, like much of DLF, runs on volunteerism and community energy. Membership in it is free, and that is made possible through the financial support of the DLF, which essentially means DLF membership institution dollars. So if you value the good work that the NDSA puts out into the world, and if you like the way that DLF has helped to advance that work and helped the coordinating committee to transform some aspects of the organization since 2006, we invite you to take a look at DLF as well and help us advocate for memberships or continued support. So infomercial is over, and now I can turn to the happy task of introducing Eira Tansey. Eira works as digital archivist records manager at the University of Cincinnati, where she is responsible for digital preservation policies, records management, and working with Born Digital Archives. She previously worked at the Louisiana Research Collection at Tulane University Library and holds a bachelor's in geography from the University of Cincinnati and an MLIS from San Jose State. As I hinted earlier, her research and writing sits at the intersection of archives, the environment, and climate change. And it delves into, quite often, the relationship between records, land ownership, and environmental policy. She works with colleagues from Penn State to map American archives' exposure to climate change, and is also collaborating on an SAA Foundation grant to develop a comprehensive open database of archival repository location data for spatial analysis. She serves as vice chair of SAA's records management section, co-chair of the program committee for the Midwest Archives Conference coming up in 2018, and is resident caretaker, a title I like, for a collective that I love, which is called Project ARC, and that stands for Archivists Responding to Climate Change. Her talk today is entitled The Necessary Knowledge, and will draw on stories from the last century of Pittsburgh's environmental history to elucidate the role that information plays in efforts to protect the environment. So please join me in welcoming Eira Tansey.
Good afternoon. In 1889, an item appeared at the bottom of the Pittsburgh Dispatch. Just a few lines long and sandwiched between reports of train accidents, it read, "Health Officer Bradley of Allegheny has started a crusade against the doctors who have not reported their cases of typhoid fever, and threatens to fine them $50 for their neglect. There is both an act of the Assembly and a city ordinance requiring these reports, and blanks have been sent to all of the city physicians." Now, the act of the Assembly had been in place for years, and it would be expanded as the death tolls rose. Pittsburgh had a disproportionately high number of typhoid fever cases, and this modest notice foreshadowed the struggles that link environmental protection, public health, and record keeping in a way that we continue to struggle with to this day. The lack of consistent morbidity reporting by physicians, despite their legal requirement to do so, reflected part of the long transition to government vital record keeping. Now, record keeping had expanded as government responsibility grew for public health matters, and public health matters were becoming more urgent as industrialization and city crowding endangered the health of Pittsburgh's air and water. As typhoid fever cases accumulated, The requirements that regulated reporting and other measures went from half a page of legal guidance to 9 pages of guidance just 2 decades later. 25 years after enough death records were issued, researchers began to establish horrifying links between the health of Pittsburgh's rivers and the health of those who drank from it. Now, for those of you who are just getting in or maybe haven't explored too far outside the hotel yet, Pittsburgh is bounded by the Allegheny River to the north, the Monongahela to the south, and both converge to form the headwaters of the Ohio River, which you can see if you walk about 10 miles away from the hotel. I get my own drinking water from the Ohio River, so I care a lot about what happens at the headwaters. Now, record keeping alone had not reduced the prevalence of typhoid, but it provided clear and convincing evidence that river pollution was to blame for the disease. No one could simply write it off as the fault of squalid tenement living or of tainted milk. But the primary culprits were political and corporate leaders who had allowed the rivers to be used as a dumping ground and neglected to create large-scale water treatment facilities. No one could say exactly how much was dumped in the rivers, but everyone knew that industrial waste of iron and steel mills, tanneries and slaughterhouses, and the human waste of communities upstream from Pittsburgh had seriously compromised local water. With sufficient death records to establish links between the water supply and typhoid fever, the picture was stark. Pittsburgh had one of the highest typhoid fever death rates in the United States. It was far higher than any other major city. Reformers pointed to other cities with successful water management systems where their death rate was a fraction that of Pittsburgh's. During a 9-year period following the health commissioner's threat to fine doctors, the death toll was between 104 and 130 per 100,000 people, while cities like Washington and Philadelphia had close to half that rate. After 4 years of political delays, during which an additional 1,500 deaths stacked up, Pittsburgh's water filtration plant finally went into operation. Now, this assessment was part of a several thousand-page study on Pittsburgh at the turn of the century. It was carried out by dozens of progressive era social researchers, and the work of the Pittsburgh Survey was published in 6 volumes between 1910 and 1914. It covered dozens of topics, including women's working conditions in sweatshops, the status of orphans and foster children, and steelworker unionization after the deadly Homestead strike. Pittsburgh, the home of U.S. Steel, the cradle of Andrew Carnegie's wealth, was a showcase for the fallout of America's Gilded Age. One of the frequently occurring motifs of the Pittsburgh Survey is a city that was coated in soot, dust, and grime. The grime was inescapable from factories where workers were directly exposed. Then they went home at the end of the day to homes where the dust settled inside the walls. The grime was the inevitable outcome of a city that was the steel capital of the world. Progressive era reformers drew explicit connections between the wastes of industrialization and public health in ways that ranged from the graphic exposure of books like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle to the less visible work of improving the kind of medical and municipal record keeping that today we take for granted. Bureaucratized record keeping, such as death certificates, had become increasingly widespread by the progressive era thanks to advances in increased literacy, the emergence of professions, and the role of the state in controlling public health. However, early record keeping was inconsistent, presenting a lot of issues for researchers. The Pittsburgh surveyors reported challenges accessing and making sense of municipal and corporate records. Surveyors who tried to research workplace injuries relied on coroner and hospital records because only some employers would turn over their records. Even then, the available records omitted pertinent information, or as many of us can sympathize with, were quite unreadable. Others investigating public sanitation records noted that while violations were often recorded, prosecutions were rarely initiated. The typhoid surveyors didn't just draw on death records to establish links between the city's water supply and typhoid fever. They also created their own records as part of a case study assessing the disease's economic impact to over 300 families. This work was carried out under the charge of a local settlement house nurse who was named Anna Heldman, and her existing relationships with local families was viewed as a critical asset to data collection. The surveyors found that there were significant income losses due to sickness from the contaminated rivers. And this echoed a problem that we continue to struggle with, which is that environmental pollution disproportionately impacts poor communities. But perhaps what the typhoid fever investigators did best was making records visible in ways that humanized the blandness of statistics. An exhibit of some of the survey's findings were exhibited at the Carnegie Institute, and the walls featured a frieze depicting over 600 silhouettes of men, women, and children. These represented the area's typhoid fever death toll from the previous year, and the borders of the published report, page of which you can see on the left-hand side here, were similarly decorated. To illustrate the entire 25-year-long death toll, the surveyors superimposed a line that started at the courthouse and ended near a filtration plant along the Allegheny River. The line represented an end-to-end body count of more than 7,422 citizens who had lost their lives to typhoid fever, or according to some fairly grim measurements, a death toll equivalent to close to 6 miles long. Now, as the field work of the survey started in 1907, a child was born 14 miles northeast of Pittsburgh. She grew up seeing the smokestacks along the Allegheny River, where a century later, a bridge was renamed in her honor on Earth Day. She transformed the U.S. environmental movement through the publication of a book that shook the country and exposed the hubris of unquestioned technology. Rachel Carson attended the Pennsylvania College for Women, which was located in Pittsburgh's East End. Today it's known as Chatham University. She studied biology and went on to become an information specialist for what eventually became the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There, she summarized scientific research into information for the public. Before writing her most famous book, Silent Spring, Rachel Carson published highly regarded and wildly popular books about the ocean, making her a household name well before she turned her attention to pesticides. Published in 1962, Silent Spring has been called a beautiful book about a dreadful topic. Carson shined a spotlight on the indiscriminate applications of popular post-war insecticides like DDT, which had started to show up in the food chains of insects, fish, birds, mammals, and eventually within the bodies of humans. A counterweight to corporate boosterism of better living through chemistry, Silent Spring painted a horrifying portrait of lifeless rivers that previously teemed with fish, silenced backyards that used to host busy bird feeders, and agricultural workers who fell ill in fields. Carson showed that indiscriminate use of pesticides couldn't be isolated to a single area or species, but that chemical toxins accumulated in the bodies of non-target species with profound consequences. A bird might die from DDT or its chemical cousins by eating contaminated worms, by ingesting DDT itself, or by starving to death as the insects it ate were wiped out during a spraying campaign. Well, Rachel Carson knew about the dangers of widespread pesticide application for years. As a fish and wildlife employee in the late 1940s, she edited reports on the division's tests of DDT. The main regulatory law affecting pesticide use at the time was it's a good pub quiz answer that I'm about to give you, was the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, also known as FIFRA. But it was primarily a registry and labeling law that was overseen by the Department of Agriculture. FIFRA was not expanded to examine toxicity on wildlife and public health until 1972, the same year that the United States banned use of DDT. Now, to write Silent Spring, Carson relied on her well-honed approaches of pursuing correspondence with field experts, reading staggering amounts of scientific literature, and working closely with librarians. In a nod to the enduring importance of librarians' labor to her writing, she acknowledged that every writer of a book based on many diverse facts owes much to the skill and helpfulness of librarians. She specifically thanked Department of Interior librarian Ida Johnston and National Institute of Health librarian Thelma Robinson for their assistance. Carson drew on everything from Audubon Club birdwatching reports to congressional hearings to federal agency reviews to research studies in international journals of medicine. Now, Rachel Carson wasn't the first person to raise the alarm about the danger of pesticides. But what set her apart was her ability to synthesize many bureaucratic reports and scholarly scientific findings into a form that resonated with the public and compelled regulatory action. She knew that the accusations that she lodged against pesticide practices were incendiary, and she took enormous care to document all of her claims. She insisted that her publisher include a 50-page guide to her sources. Well, this wasn't just to ensure scholarly rigor. After all, Silent Spring was a book that was published for a general audience, but it was to proactively address the very real concern that she and her publisher might be targets of a libel suit. So what happened to Rachel Carson next was a blueprint of attacks that have been replicated against researchers whose findings turn out to be very inconvenient to industries and their government enablers. When Silent Spring was published, corporate interests came for Carson with a viciousness that feels both dated and alarmingly contemporary at the same time. She was castigated for her lack of an advanced degree, for her suspicious love of animals, and for being a hysterical spinster. Carson took care in her measured prose to note that she was not opposed to all pesticide use, but that her opposition was to the unrestrained way in which they were used with scant attention paid to existing safety studies. 8 years after Silent Spring was published, Richard Nixon signed a reorganization plan that created the Environmental Protection Agency. Consolidated responsibility for existing environmental laws, including FIFRA, into one agency. Many of these laws were expanded to require significant new record-keeping responsibilities to document pollution emissions and assure a citizen's right to know about potential toxic exposure. The EPA's original charge included the mandate that it gather information on pollution to strengthen environmental protection programs and recommend policy changes. Now, one of the greatest underrated legacies of the EPA's creation is that it has enormously expanded the amount of environmental information available to the public through monitoring, reporting, and permitting record systems. We don't often think of the creation of records as a victory, but effectively addressing pollution without those records is incredibly difficult, as we can see if we look at the Pennsylvania landscape. Shortly after President Trump announced that he would pull the United States out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, he stated, "I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris." While the city of Pittsburgh has made notable progress towards a fossil-free future, it is also in the center of the Marcellus Shale region, the largest U.S. natural gas field. It covers 3/5 of Pennsylvania, as well as parts of Ohio, West Virginia, New York, and Maryland. And for the last 4 years, Pennsylvania has been the nation's second largest natural gas producer. Much of this growth has been due to the expansion of hydraulic fracturing, which many of you probably know better as fracking. Fracking has been around for decades, but it wasn't widely deployed until the early 2000s. And fracking is a process where large amounts of water, sand, and chemicals are injected into deep wells to fracture or crack open rock formations in order to more easily release oil and gas deposits. Fracking's immediate environmental risks come from potential links to earthquakes, methane leakage, and water contamination. And many of the rural residents in the Marcellus Shale region have complained that fracking operations have contaminated their water supplies. Fracking poses documented danger to water supplies, but establishing a conclusive link to hold energy companies accountable is difficult because of an absence of industry and governmental records. The oil and gas industry claims that there's minimal risk because fracking happens in rock formations below groundwater supplies. However, there are many other routes to water contamination, including on-site chemical spills, failures in underground piping, and improper waste disposal. Contamination of well water, which is a common water supply in many rural regions, can be especially difficult to prove because there are often no baseline water purity records prior to fracking. Furthermore, many industries avoid full disclosure of their fracking chemicals by claiming them as confidential business information. Regulation depends on reliable record keeping. Regulations mandate what records will be created in order to ensure health and safety. Industries with potentially serious environmental impact are often not regulated until there is significant public outcry. There's often spotty documentation at best on the early environmental impacts of new technologies, leaving citizens without the information they need to prove pollution claims. The problem is worsened by regulatory agencies that struggle with underfunding and an inability or unwillingness to exercise their enforcement powers. It's further compounded by politicians who are hostile to environmental regulation. And these issues can be seen in the recent failures of Pennsylvania's Department of Environmental Protection to regulate fracking. In 2014, the Pennsylvania Auditor General audited the state's Department of Environmental Protection, DEP, reviewing their performance in monitoring and investigating fracking's effects on water supplies. This is a big deal, because if you think fracking has contaminated your water supply, the first thing that you do is you make a complaint to DEP. That then triggers an investigation. The audit found failure after failure in both DEP's regulatory responsibilities and its record-keeping practices. When citizens filed complaints, they didn't consistently receive a final letter stating the outcome of an investigation. An example of that is here on the screen. Inspection records were kept inconsistently. There wasn't independent verification of industry's self-reported waste. Records were not organized in a way to answer simple big-picture questions, such as, how many complaints do we have related to impacts on water supplies? And DEP routinely cited confidentiality concerns as an excuse to block access to public records. The auditor stated that he could not conclude whether public health is being threatened by the gas industry because DEP's record keeping is so poor. The findings of the state auditor are similar to what much of the scholarly literature on fracking says, that the dangers to water are known, but no one knows quite how widespread it is because state and industry record keeping is so inconsistent. Although the DEP has recently improved some of its online public records access, including access to crucial citizen complaint records, finding and making sense of these records still remains notoriously difficult. Dissatisfied with the status quo, activists have filed numerous public records requests in order to assemble information in a manner that is far more accessible and comprehensible to the public. The Pittsburgh-based Public Herald literally went to DEP regional offices to scan thousands of citizen complaints, which they've mapped and made available on their website, which has an amazing URL I love as an archivist. It's publicfiles.org. So, in each of these regional stories, reliable record keeping has been essential to documenting the links between pollution and polluters. When industry and government roll back regulations that require reliable record keeping, we are quickly on the road to pollution without polluters, in which we know that water and air is being contaminated, but we lack the reliable evidence to document exactly who that polluter is. Last year's keynote by Burgess Jules was titled, "Confronting Our Failure of Care Around the Legacies of Marginalized People in the Archives." Burgess called for us to acknowledge our willful ignorance around the histories of marginalized people of color and to allow new knowledge to affect how we do our work. The failure of care is a theme that comes up time and again when we consider how injustices perpetrated against land, air, and water are inseparable from the injustices perpetrated against marginalized peoples. Pollution of air and water disproportionately affects poor communities and communities of color. And yet, with all of our knowledge about this reality, we failed to embed the concept of care into the way we approach environmental information and record keeping. What does care look like? What could care look like in an environmental record keeping context? I think it looks a little bit like record keeping that recognizes that impacts to the environment are inseparable to the impacts on our bodies and on our communities. While I was preparing for this keynote, I ran across an intriguing example of what this looks like. It was in a story from the Allegheny Front, which is a local website dedicated to regional environmental journalism. The story profiled a local summer youth employment program in which teenagers are working in the predominantly black neighborhood of Lincoln-Leamington on issues related to lead poisoning. The neighborhood has older housing stock, which means a higher likelihood of lead paint. And like many cities with aging infrastructure, Pittsburgh is grappling with serious lead concerns in its water lines. Now, there is no safe level of lead exposure for children, but the CDC has established what is known as a reference level at which the agency recommends public health actions be initiated. That reference level is anything above a blood lead level of 5 micrograms per deciliter. And in 2013, 7.5% of tested children here in Allegheny County had blood lead levels that were above that reference level. And several thousand more children have some level of exposure above 0. The Allegheny County Council recently passed mandatory lead testing for 1- and 2-year-old children, and the law will go into effect on January 1. A councilman supporting the legislation stated, "Lead testing gives us information, and without information, we can't assess the problem that we are facing." Over the summer, the students in the youth employment program mapped buildings in the neighborhood. They talked with residents about their lead exposure mitigation strategies, and they conducted surveys in cooperation with the Allegheny County Health Department. This is an excerpt of it pictured here. The students also spent 3 days in Flint, Michigan, talking to activists and community stakeholders who are working so hard on the multi-year lead issues in Flint. Now, I recently spoke to Denise Jones, who served as the project's director. And she noted that while there's a lot of quantitative data, it has very little qualitative detail. The health department might be able to say how many houses were built with lead paint or have lead service lines, but it didn't have information on how caregivers employed various strategies to keep their children safe. Knocking on doors, clipboards in hand, these students filled in the care-based details that are all too often missing from records that rarely account for how our environments impact our lives. Preserving and making environmental information accessible is essential if we hope to bring any eventual accountability to power, because the legal and cultural context we live in requires documentary evidence in the form of trustworthy data and reliable records. Polluters know this, and it's why rolling back regulations that document who is polluting and how is often their first line of attack on what they call bureaucratic red tape. But the documentation that red tape creates is essential to building legal cases and moral claims against polluters. A disturbing number of today's attacks on federal environmental protection involve attacking information. Some of these have rolled back proposals for industry to increase its monitoring and reporting of methane. Methane has even more heat-trapping potential than carbon, and methane leaks are highly associated with the fracking industry. Now, the industry claims that natural gas is a cleaner fuel than coal, but methane leaks undermine that claim. And if we don't require record keeping for methane emissions, it's hard to determine the extent of our current contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. I often think about how many libraries have an uncomfortable inheritance of what the Gilded Age steel industry wrought on air and water and on the bodies of its workers. Andrew Carnegie made his fortune from steel, and he made it here in Pittsburgh. And it was his philanthropy to over 1,000 communities that nearly doubled the amount of public libraries in the United States. Many of our libraries and archives that we work in are deeply tangled in fossil fuels, from institutional endowments that are invested in BP or Exxon, foundation-funded projects that are seeded from the money of oil and gas barons, preservation of our digital content on coal-powered servers, and reliance on fossil fuel transportation to come together at conferences to dream of a better future. Environmental information is critical to our ability to meet the challenges that lie ahead, and I believe as information professionals, we have an ethical obligation to incorporate environmental care into our professional practice. I've been working around these issues of archives and the environment for a few years. I think we're at the point where the profession knows that we need to do something, but we're not really sure what we should be doing. Should we rewrite our disaster plans to incorporate sea level rise? Should we put rooftop gardens and solar panels on top of our buildings? Should we incorporate the environmental footprint of cloud storage into our contracts with digital preservation services? Well, ideally, we should answer yes to all of these questions, but they all avoid the critical question of what we do about environmental information. So before we can ask, what do we do about environmental information, we have to answer, how do we as a profession develop an ethic of environmental justice? Because we can't sustain the issue of preserving environmental information for the long haul until we make caring about the environment a totally normal and routine aspect of our personal and professional lives. People arrive at an ethic of environmental justice through different routes, but at its core, it depends on cultivating a sense of care and duty for the places in which we live and work, and understanding how environmental degradation compounds existing injustices. In the archives profession, the archivist as keeper and caretaker trope has been thrashed for its implications that archivists are passive agents who worship at the altar of neutrality. But as multiple archivists have recently asserted the importance of an ethics of care in our profession, I would like to think that we are on the way to reclaiming archivists as caretakers in the best and most feminist sense of that word. That to care for something is a profound act of great importance. It's essential to our ongoing existence, and it's the bedrock of preservation. To ensure that information is preserved so that it might be used by citizens for a safe and healthy environment, is the opposite of passively keeping information. It's to assert that preservation of information, preservation of the earth, and preservation of public health are very closely linked. As we saw after the election, there were many decentralized efforts that took place to address concerns over access and preservation of federal environmental data on websites like the EPA's, NOAA, NASA's, Department of the Interior, and so on. In some of those efforts, librarians and archivists played an active leadership role, while other efforts barely had any librarians or archivists present. Why was this? I suspect it's because for many of us, we do not have environmental justice incorporated into our sense of what it means to be an information professional. This information may be invisible to most of us much of the time, but I hope I'm starting to convince you that if you like to breathe clean air and drink clean water, you should care very, very deeply about this. So as I've laid out, effective environmental protection depends on good environmental information. And that space is where we as information professionals most strongly bring our talents. So to return to the question, what should we do about environmental information? We need to identify the unfolding threats to its preservation and accessibility from local to international stages. And I want to note that this is not just happening at the federal level, and it was also a problem long before the current administration and will be long after it. If we're not given a seat at these tables, then to paraphrase the late, great Shirley Chisholm, we need to bring our own folding chairs. We need to assert that we as information professionals deeply care about environmental information, especially if we also claim that we care about the communities we serve. So just as there is not a single solution for climate change, but multiple paths to transitioning to a fossil-free future, I think there are multiple ways that we can work towards ensuring environmental information is preserved and used. So obviously, there are a lot more than these few suggestions here. But one way to start is we can get involved in groups working on federal environmental data, and it's been really wonderful for me as a newcomer to this community to hear so much of that already since I've been here. So it seems like the DLF and NDSA communities are very, very hip to this. That's great. We can become friends with scientists and journalists to organize around our common interests. We can help citizen science projects with data management and preservation plans. We can teach local environmental activists how to find and use environmental information. We can surface new sources of environmental information in our collections. You occasionally see these stories where someone digitizes a bunch of 19th century farmers' diaries, and hey, all of a sudden we have all this precipitation data we didn't have before. I like those stories. I like to read more of them. We can surface new sources of already said that. We can prioritize local environmental topics for our collection development policies. We can demand that industries voluntarily disclose more information about their environmental impact. And we can interrogate the appraisal and retention decisions of regulatory records to ensure that records are retained long enough to support public interest. And finally, we can fight back against deregulation that rolls back reporting and monitoring record-keeping requirements. The balance of power concerning the creation and access of environmental information has favored polluting industries for far too long. And I'm gravely concerned that this imbalance is becoming more severe at the exact moment when crises of climate change, ecological collapse, and environmental injustice are becoming too urgent to ignore any longer. Whether we identify as librarians, archivists, curators, records managers, or some other branch of the information profession family tree, all of us can, and all of us need to, contribute to preserving environmental information and ensuring its usability. Rachel Carson lamented in Silent Spring that the evidence against pesticides was stacking up, but far too many people chose to ignore it. She wrote, "Much of the necessary knowledge is now available, but we do not use it. We train ecologists in our universities and even employ them in our government agencies, but we seldom take their advice. We allow the chemical death rain to fall as though there were no alternative, whereas in fact, there are many. And our ingenuity could soon discover many more if given opportunity. Rachel Carson wrote those words more than 50 years ago, and yet it feels as if it could describe our world today. We need to build an alternative world, one that is rooted in advice and ingenuity. We have the necessary knowledge. Now let's try to figure out how to use it.
Everyone will notice that there's microphones set up on each end of the room and one in the middle. And we have plenty of time for question and answer from Eira. So if anyone has a question, we'd invite you to step up to a microphone.
Hi, Eira. Thank you. That was excellent, as always. My question for you is, do you see a connection in that most environmental pollution impacts kind of communities at the margin? Do you think that there's a connection between that fact and the fact that our profession isn't getting as involved or active here because the lack of diversity in our profession?
I had never thought of it that way, but I think you're right. Yes, so that probably is something we need to interrogate as well.
Hi, Eira. I was struck by something you said just really sort of near the end of your talk about the idea of environmental justice. And there's a lot kind of going around in the information organizations communities around social justice and diversity, inclusion. And I was just struck by the idea of like, where is environmental justice in that social justice, diversity, and inclusion? And I'm wondering if you are aware of libraries, other organizations, individual archives that are thinking about their DS&IJ statements, values that actually specifically include environmental justice.
So just so I understand the question, if any library organizations that are working on diversity and inclusion have explicitly incorporated the environmental aspect of that into their work.
Yeah, because like we hear this as social justice, diversity, inclusion, but I'm trying to think about, where, right, examples of where environmental justice is particularly called out as part of that, whatever the social justice, diversity, inclusion is.
So I personally don't know, but I am not going to stand up here and say that that hasn't been done. Is there anyone here that knows of an example? Because I sure would love to hear that too. Okay, well, that's fairly telling that no one's jumped up, so yeah.
Anyone else?
Please ask me more questions. I really want to answer them.
It's sort of a question. I guess more of a comment first. Just that what I really appreciate amongst many things in what you just said is that the connection or the sort of promotion of the shift in the role of archivists and information professionals to get closer to that moment of creation of the information and the records, and our role in advocating if that creation is being hidden or there's barriers to that, or if there's even a place for us to participate in that process in some way. And clearly that's throwing out the notion of neutrality, but it's recognizing our role as institutions and providing access to the public, right, to this information in some way. And I guess beyond what you've listed in the bullet points as sort of starting points, do you think that there's something sort of collectively that we can get behind, either sort of things within what's going on in the DLF community, or something that sort of explicitly states that sort of shift in that role around areas of environmental information and justice?
Okay, I think there were two questions there.
Okay,
So
thanks for parsing that.
The first was about the inserting ourselves as a community earlier in the process of records creation. And then the second was, help me out, was
just that, like, how that could manifest as part of these groups that already exist, and what you think, because you had those bullet points of maybe what individuals or institutions could do,
right?
But I'm curious what that looks like, and like all the people here as part of this
gathering. Okay, got it. All right, so I'm going to answer that last one first. I'm really hesitant. I've always been very, very hesitant to say this is the thing everyone should do, right? Because that's a really common and I think valid criticism against a lot of environmentalists, which is that they say, here's the one thing you need to do. And the reality is we have to do a lot of different things, and different people, different organizations can do different things better than other things. So I really don't like the idea of a mono solution, and that's why I really just want people, my goal is basically to just cause the switch to flip. And so for people to just start thinking about these things, because quite honestly, I don't think we think about a lot of these things. And then going back to your other question about inserting ourselves earlier, there was a really interesting example of how I thought, man, we really need to talk, we really just need to talk more about what it is that librarians and archivists do, because when I was reading about some of the work of the Public Herald, which does incredible work. But one of the things that they noted that made me, as someone who's a records manager and does retention scheduling for my institution, I realized, people don't actually know what records management is, because they had gotten a copy of the retention schedule for DEP, and they, saw that it said, after X years, these record groups are destroyed. And Public Herald characterized that as them cooking the books.
Right.
And I thought, oh, hold up, wait a minute. Now you can make very good arguments about how long you retain certain things based on, when we think certain diseases might show up in certain populations, but just because you're destroying records doesn't mean you're cooking the books. And then I realized, this is because no one understands what a retention schedule is. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of made me think, well, this is really why people like me, who are very much on the front lines of this, need to start talking more to people. So, I want to talk to librarians and archivists because I want everyone to care about this, but I also need to talk to scientists and talk to journalists and talk to activists and be like, this is what's normal in managing information. And then this is what's not normal. Mm-hmm. And I think it takes that librarian and archivist perspective to help people understand what's normal and what's not normal.
Thanks for finding the questions.
Kind of to tack onto that a little bit, and this is a poorly formed question, but your talk also has me thinking a lot about the way in which a lot of digital technologies are basically framed as green, when of course they are not really. I mean, cheap data relies on cheap energy, fossil fuel energy, and the networks of extraction and exploitation which allow us to use these technologies are all very well documented. And so I kind of wondered what your thoughts were on the appropriate ways as a profession and as institutions we might engage with that truth as well.
So I would, do people know what carbon pricing is? Can I just get a quick show of hands? Who knows what carbon pricing is? Okay, so maybe I should explain this. Okay, carbon pricing is, for a long time, it's basically a way of trying to put a price tag on what it costs society to have emissions out there, right? And so this was actually a scheme a long time ago that really never went into effect in the United States. But there was actually bipartisan talk about it only about a decade ago, about instituting carbon pricing. So, for example, if you are getting your electricity from a coal-powered utility, there's essentially an extra tax on top of that to reflect the amount of externalities that carbon puts onto our world. And the idea was that over time it would become so expensive that we would kind of be forced to look at greener energy strategies. And man, so if some institution just goes ahead and carbon prices their stuff, that would be awesome. Please do that. And I know that's a really radical suggestion, but one of the things that I often encounter is that we sort of, as librarians and archivists, we just think that we are infallible, right? We are so good, we preserve good stuff, and therefore, we shouldn't interrogate these things. And I'm really horrified by that. And I think we should hold ourselves as models of what we want society to look like. And so if we are in a capacity where, we are kind of stuck for now with using services that are reliant on fossil fuel, then maybe we could at least be transparent about what that means. And I don't think any of us are yet.
So I think we have one over here.
Oh, that actually answered my question, so I'll just say thanks for a great talk.
Hi, thanks. I'm just interested to hear if you have thoughts about this proposal that I've heard made by a few other people and that you referred to in your talk a little bit, or it's implicated in a comment you made, that maybe the sort of best practices and standards for environmental conditions and preservation or conservation of materials and sort of what temperatures different storage facilities need to be kept at. And I'm not really clear about what effect that would actually have on the carbon footprint of our work, but I've heard this suggested, and I'm interested to hear whether you think the standards maybe need to be adjusted in light of environmental questions and concerns, and also anything else you have to say about that topic.
Yeah, I'm not this is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, so yes, I am generally in favor of interrogating those things. But I will say that my collaborator, Ben Goldman at Penn State, has written and talked a lot about this, so if this is a topic that you're interested in, he's keep an eye on what he's doing. And there's a lot of other people that are more talking about the carbon footprint of, especially cloud infrastructure. They aren't necessarily archivists. But yeah, I don't know. I'm in favor of questioning everything, but that's because I'm a rabble-rouser.
So I think that's all the time that we have. If you have more questions for Eira, we're going to have a wonderful reception tonight. But before we get into the reception, I would like everyone to give another round of applause for Eira, please.